A 15-year-old girl helped break bus segregation, yet her juvenile record remained for 66 years. A black chemist created a treatment that gave patients a chance to leave forced isolation, but her name vanished while senior men carried the method forward. How many inventions, businesses, and national victories have we been taught without being told who made them possible? What happens when a country keeps the achievement, removes the woman, and hands children a textbook with the missing name presented as complete history? Some of these women lost homes, professional credit, even the right to be remembered under their own names. One waited more than a century for recognition. This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Today we uncover 10 black women who changed America, and the history books that nearly erased them. Number 1. Claudette Colvin. America still rides on victories won by black women whose names were pushed out of the lesson. The laws changed, the institutions survived, the benefits became part of everyday life. Yet the women who carried those changes were often reduced to a footnote or replaced by a more convenient face. Claudette Colvin was one of them. On March 2, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks, Claudette left Booker T. Washington High School and boarded a Montgomery bus. She sat in the section assigned to black passengers, but that space could be taken whenever a white rider needed it. The driver moved the color line back and ordered black passengers to stand, though they had paid the same fare. The students beside Claudette rose one after another, while she remained seated. Earlier, she had been studying the Constitution, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. Their stories filled her mind when the driver demanded her seat. Claudette said she felt history holding her down, as if those women were telling her that promises printed in school books had to mean something beyond the classroom. Police officers boarded, pulled her from the seat, handcuffed her, and took her into juvenile court. She was charged with violating segregation rules, disturbing the peace, and assaulting or resisting an officer, an accusation she denied. Montgomery considered her too young to be heard, yet old enough to be treated as a criminal. During the appeal, the charges tied to segregation were dropped, while the accusation involving the officer remained. That maneuver left Claudette under indefinite probation and pushed the bus law out of the center of her case. The city could keep a stain on a child's record without defending the law behind it. How can a country praise its constitution while using a 15-year-old girl's body to keep an unjust law standing? Black women in Montgomery spent years documenting abuse on the buses. Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council had warned officials that a boycott was coming. Claudette's arrest seemed to offer the case they needed, but movement leaders faced a brutal calculation. She was poor, young, and months later became pregnant outside marriage. She was not pregnant on the bus, yet organizers feared white newspapers would turn a constitutional wrong into gossip about a black teenager's life. To be believed, she was expected to be wounded without ever appearing human. Claudette returned in February 1956 as one of 4 plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, alongside Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith. Their lawsuit confronted the mayor, police, bus company, and state agencies enforcing segregation. The girl Montgomery had labeled a juvenile delinquent, described that machinery before a federal court. On June 5, 1956, the court ruled that segregated bus seating violated the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court allowed the decision to stand later that year. Claudette helped overturn the law before she was old enough to vote. Her record remained for 66 years. It was cleared in 2021. Claudette died in 2026, after living long enough to see her name begin returning to classrooms. The buses had been integrated for decades. The ruling still stood. Yet for most of her life, the girl whose testimony helped make that freedom possible remained outside the story America told its children. Number 2. Alice Augusta Ball. Some of America's medical advances survived even after the black women behind them were pushed out of the story. Alice Ball's treatment changed what was possible for people with Hansen's disease, Yet the method lived on while her name nearly disappeared. To understand what was taken from her, we first have to understand what patients faced. Hansen's disease, then called leprosy, was poorly understood and stigmatized. Under an 1865 Hawaii law, people suspected of having the disease could be taken from their homes and sent into isolation. Beginning in 1866, many were removed to Kalaupapa and Kalawao on Molokai. About 8,000 people lived there before compulsory isolation ended in 1969. A diagnosis could mean more than illness. It could mean a mother losing her children, a husband disappearing from his household, or a family hiding someone they loved, because officials might take that person away with no promise of return. Doctors had one possible treatment, chalmugra oil, a remedy long used in Asia, but the oil was thick, bitter, and difficult for the body to absorb. Swallowed, it often caused sickness. Applied to the skin, it worked unevenly. Injected raw, it could be painfully harsh. Medicine still lacked a practical way to use it. That was the problem placed before Alice Augusta Ball. Born in Seattle in 1892, Ball studied pharmaceutical chemistry and pharmacy at the University of Washington. She had published research before moving to the College of Hawaii, where she became the first woman and first black person to earn a master's degree in chemistry. She was also the school's first black woman chemistry instructor. At 23, she entered a field where people who looked like her were rarely allowed authority, even when others needed their knowledge. Ball separated the useful fatty acids from chalmugra oil and converted them into ethyl esters, creating a preparation that could be injected and absorbed more effectively. She did not discover chalmugra, and the method was not a complete cure by modern standards. What she achieved was still remarkable. She turned a difficult traditional remedy into the most workable treatment then available. For some patients, improvement meant more than fewer symptoms. It meant doctors might consider releasing them from isolation and allowing them to return to their families. Ball never saw how far her work would travel. She became ill and died on December 31, 1916 at 24, before she could publish the full method. After her death, senior male researchers continued the work. A 1920 paper carried the names of Arthur Dean and Richard Renshaw. Alice Ball's name was missing. Harry Holman credited her in 1922, but that correction did not place her in textbooks. Her method remained in use until better drugs arrived in the 1940s. Only in 2026 did the American Chemical Society recognize the Ball method as a National Historic Chemical Landmark, 110 years after her death. Science kept the treatment because it worked. America took more than a century to return the woman to her own discovery. Number 3. Ida B. Wells. In the spring of 1892, Memphis was a city where black freedom existed on paper more easily than it did in daily life. Black families could work, save, open businesses, and build communities. Yet a successful black shop could still be treated as a threat, especially when it drew customers from a white competitor. That was the world Ida B. Wells was living in when one grocery store became the center of a tragedy that changed her life. The store was called People's Grocery. It stood in a black neighborhood known as The Curve and was managed by Thomas Moss, a postal worker, husband, father, and close friend of Wells. Calvin McDowell and Will Stewart also worked there. The shop was more than a place to buy food. It was proof that black people could build something of their own after slavery and keep money within their community. Yet in Memphis, that very success carried danger. A dispute near the store grew into a larger confrontation. White newspapers quickly described the black men around People's Grocery as violent conspirators, while the economic rivalry behind the conflict was pushed aside. Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were arrested and placed in the Shelby County Jail. They had not been tried, and no court had declared them guilty. Before dawn on March 9th, a masked mob entered the jail, removed the 3 men, and killed them before they ever saw a courtroom. The government had locked them behind bars, yet it did not keep them alive long enough to receive the justice it claimed to provide. Afterward, People's Grocery was wrecked, and the nearby white competitor acquired the property cheaply. A thriving black business had vanished. 3 families had lost the men they loved, and the press had written a version of events that made the victims sound responsible for their own deaths. For Wells, Thomas Moss was not a statistic. He was someone she knew and trusted. His death forced her to question the story white newspapers repeated so often, that lynching was simply punishment for terrible crimes. She began gathering names, dates, accusations, business disputes, and details about who benefited once a victim was gone. What she found reached far beyond Memphis. Many victims never received trials. Some had owned land, competed with white businesses, voted, organized workers, or refused to act submissive. Wells turned scattered cases into a documented record, later published in works such as A Red Record, showing how racial terror could protect money, political control, and white power. While Wells was away, a mob destroyed the office and printing equipment of the Memphis Free Speech. Returning could have cost her life, so she continued from elsewhere, carrying the evidence to New York, Chicago, and Britain. For years, textbooks often reduced her to a brave journalist. The fuller story is harder to forget. A black woman lost her friend, her newspaper, and her home because she refused to let a mob write the final version of the truth. Number 4, Mary Jane Richards. A historical marker once honored a black Union spy named Mary Elizabeth Bowser. The trouble is that the woman behind the story never used that name, and the portrait shown as hers belonged to someone else. Even while trying to remember her, history replaced her with a legend. The surviving records point instead to Mary Jane Richards, born into slavery in Virginia around 1840. A church entry from 1846 did not record her parents' hopes or childhood. It described her simply as a colored child belonging to Mrs. Van Loo. Before Mary could choose what to call herself, another family's ownership had already become her first identity. She later received an education, was sent to Liberia through the colonization movement, and returned to Richmond before the Civil War. There, she joined a unionist network that included enslaved people, black residents, laborers, and white opponents of the Confederacy. They carried information, aided prisoners, and helped people escape, while discovery could mean imprisonment or death. In an 1865 speech, Richards said she entered Jefferson Davis's home while seeking laundry work, reached a private room, and examined papers. The men around her saw a black woman and assumed she could neither understand nor use what she witnessed. Their contempt became the opening through which she moved. After the war, Richards did not disappear. She spoke about politics, taught freed children and adults, and struggled to build schools amid poverty, scarce supplies, and threats from white groups for resisting black education. Yet the popular version remembered a silent servant with a miraculous memory, not the outspoken teacher who helped freedom take root. Her life needed no invented disguise. It needed a country willing to remember her without changing her name, borrowing another woman's face, or placing a white organizer at the center of her courage. Number 5. Annie D. Turnbow Malone. At the turn of the 20th century, most black women were shut out of jobs offering steady pay, training, or a path to ownership. Domestic work, laundry, and farm labor were often among the few doors left open. Annie Turnbow Malone looked at that narrow world and built something far larger than a beauty company. In St. Louis, she created Poro College, a complex combining a training school, factory, offices, shipping rooms, salon, and community hall. Women who had spent years working in other people's homes could learn hair care, sales, bookkeeping, and customer service, then return to their neighborhoods with a trade of their own. Poro products moved through a national network of agents. Company histories claimed that tens of thousands of women were connected to the system. Not all became wealthy, but for many, selling products or serving clients from a front room offered something rare: income they could control, without asking a white employer for permission. Malone also built where segregation had closed doors. Poro's auditorium hosted meetings, performances, and visitors who might be rejected by white hotels or halls. The building gave Black St. Louis a place to enter with dignity rather than apology. Before Madam C.J., Walker became the famous name in Black beauty. She had worked as a commission agent in Malone's Poro network. Walker later built her own company, yet public memory made room for one pioneer and pushed the earlier builder toward the margins. Malone's empire weakened through divorce litigation, taxes, economic crisis, and the Great Depression. The St. Louis building was eventually lost, and much of the business archive remained incomplete. Still, the system she built had already changed thousands of lives. Its classrooms, paychecks, and businesses outlasted the walls. What faded first was the woman's name above the door, number 6. Maggie Lena Walker. In the early 20th century, a black family in Richmond could work hard, save, and still be turned away when they needed a bank account, a loan, or a mortgage. Jim Crow did not control schools and streetcars. It also decided whose money was trusted and whose name could appear on a property deed. Maggie Lena Walker understood that injustice from childhood. Her mother, Elizabeth Draper, had once been enslaved and survived through cooking and laundry work. Maggie helped deliver clothes to wealthy homes, carrying the labor of a black woman into houses her family could never finance. In 1899, Walker took charge of the Independent Order of St. Luke, a black mutual aid society that was nearly bankrupt. It had barely $32 in cash and hundreds of dollars in debt. She received far less pay than the man before her, yet rebuilt the organization around a newspaper, a store, and a bank. Street. Luke Penny Savings Bank opened in Richmond in 1903. Some customers arrived with only a few cents. The bank accepted their deposits, created office jobs for black women, and offered loans to families ignored by white institutions. By the early 1920s, at least 600 members had paid off home mortgages through the system. Walker knew that saving meant little if no institution would turn those savings into ownership. Her bank helped move black names from laundry lists and wage books onto accounts, mortgages, and deeds. When the economy collapsed, she chose consolidation to protect depositors rather than preserve her title. The successor bank survived the Great Depression and remained black-controlled into the 21st century. Textbooks often reduce Maggie Walker to a first. Her deeper achievement was quieter. She built the door through which thousands of families could carry their earnings toward a home they owned. Number 7. Katherine Johnson. Before the first American astronaut circled Earth, a black woman in Virginia was solving equations that could decide whether he returned alive. Her work helped carry the United States into space, yet for years the public celebrated the rockets and the men inside them, while barely knowing her name. Katherine Johnson joined the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1953. At the time, computer was a job title for people who performed calculations by hand. Black women at Langley were placed in a separate unit called West Area Computing and worked under segregation, while the agency depended on their skill. Johnson's ability moved her beyond routine calculations. She analyzed flight data, entered meetings where women were rarely invited, and co-authored a 1960 report explaining how to place a spacecraft into orbit. Her name appeared in the mathematics guiding Project Mercury. In 1961, she calculated the path for Alan Shepard's Freedom 7 mission, which sent the first American into space. A year later, NASA prepared John Glenn's flight using electronic computers. Before launch, Glenn asked Katherine Johnson to check their numbers herself. A nation was preparing to prove its scientific power to the world, while the astronauts' confidence rested on the judgment of a black woman inside a segregated system. Johnson continued contributing to Apollo and other missions. She did not send astronauts into space alone, but her calculations helped determine where spacecraft should travel and how they could come home. For decades, school books reduced the space race to presidents, astronauts, and machines. Johnson's equations were never missing from NASA's work. Only the woman behind them was missing from public memory. In 2015, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. By then, the numbers had carried history for half a century. The name attached to them was catching up at last. Number 8. Rebecca Lee Crumpler. In 1864, while the Civil War was still tearing the country apart, formerly enslaved people were beginning to hear the language of freedom. Yet many remained sick, hungry, homeless, and unwelcome in hospitals. Into that divided world stepped Rebecca Lee Crumpler, a black woman entering a profession that barely accepted women and rarely treated black lives with equal dignity. Before medical school, Crumpler had spent about 8 years working as a nurse. In 1860, she entered the New England Female Medical College in Boston, one of the few schools willing to educate women. 4 years later, at 33, she became the first known black woman in the United States to earn a medical degree. Her diploma opened a door, but it did not erase prejudice. After the war, Crumpler went to Richmond, Virginia, where more than 30,000 black residents were struggling to build lives after slavery. Many faced disease, malnutrition, overcrowding, and doctors who refused to treat them or dismissed their suffering. Through an agency connected to the Freedmen's Bureau, she cared for poor women, children, and families who had been declared free, but were still left dangerously unprotected. Crumpler later returned to Boston and continued treating women and children, often serving people with little money. In 1883, she published a book of medical discourses, sharing guidance on infant care, nutrition, women's health, and prevention. At a time when childhood deaths were often accepted as unavoidable, she argued that careful observation and early treatment could save lives. No authenticated portrait of Rebecca Crumpler survives. For roughly 125 years, even her grave had no proper marker. What remains is her book, her medical degree, and the lives touched by a woman who entered places freedom had reached on paper, but healing had not, and where human dignity was still painfully withheld. Number 9. Mary Fields. In the late 19th century, the American West was expanding through railroads, ranches, missions, and small settlements separated by vast distances. Yet maps rarely showed the people who kept those places connected. Mary Fields, a black woman born into slavery around 1832, became one of them. After the Civil War, Fields lived and worked in Ohio before traveling to Montana in the mid-1880s to help Mother Amadeus and the Ursuline sisters at St. Peter's Mission. The mission also operated a boarding school for Native children, placing Fields inside a complicated institution shaped by both service and forced assimilation. Her work included hauling supplies, caring for animals, repairing buildings, and handling the difficult labor that allowed the settlement to function. In 1895, when Fields was already in her 60s, she secured a federal Star Route contract to carry mail between Cascade and St. Peter's Mission. These routes served communities beyond convenient railroad access. The carrier was an independent contractor, responsible for delivering letters, official papers, orders, news, and small parcels across rough country and severe weather. Fields held the route for 2 four-year terms, continuing until 1903. For an older black woman living in a region dominated by white men, winning and keeping that contract required more than physical strength. It required reliability and work that families, businesses, and local officials depended upon. Later stories turned her into Stagecoach Mary, filling her life with gunfights, wolves, saloons, and dramatic escapes that cannot always be verified. Those legends made her memorable, yet they often pushed her actual achievement aside. For 8 years, Mary Fields carried connection itself. While popular history filled the frontier with white cowboys, a formerly enslaved black woman was moving its mail, keeping an isolated community tied to the wider country, one delivery at a time, through every season. Number 10. Shirley Chisholm. In 1972, presidential politics was still treated as a space reserved for white men. Backed by powerful donors, party leaders and long-established networks. Shirley Chisholm entered that world knowing she would be judged before many voters ever heard her policies, simply because she was both black and a woman. She had not appeared from nowhere. Chisholm had worked in education, organized in Brooklyn, served in the New York State Assembly, and in 1968 became the first black woman elected to Congress. There she spoke about childcare, poverty, hunger, domestic workers, education, and the cost of the Vietnam War for families already struggling at home. On January 25, 1972, she announced that she would seek the Democratic presidential nomination. She did not present herself as the candidate of one race or one gender. She said she was running to represent all Americans, especially those who had long been spoken about but rarely listened to. The campaign was painfully underfunded. Major donors doubted she could win. Party leaders offered little machinery, and some black political figures and feminist leaders chose other strategies. Each refusal of support made her campaign weaker, and that weakness was then used as proof that she had never been a serious candidate. Still, Chisholm kept traveling, seeking and gathering delegates. At the Democratic National Convention, she received 152 votes. It was not enough to secure the nomination, but it was far more than a symbolic gesture. For generations, black women had been asked to wait until the country was ready. Chisholm stepped onto the presidential stage before anyone granted permission. She did not reach the White House. Yet after 1972, no one could honestly say that a black woman had never stood there and demanded to be considered on equal terms with every man who entered the race. These 10 women did not wait for history to invite them in. They changed laws, medicine, science, business, and freedom itself, even when their names were pushed aside. Remembering them is part of finishing their work. Subscribe to Hidden Black Chronicles and help bring buried stories back into the light.